say that in international disputes, as of course like the disputes of all nations, and in the dealing with them, the ultimate deciding factor is the military power they can bring to bear. We think in support of this, what are two points? First, that states are motivated by and react most to the exercise of that power and the ability of other states to use that power against them. And secondly, even in any way, even when institutions or treaties arise, they ultimately come to reflect the strength of those relative powers, the strength of those swords against each other, and hold only so long as the balance of that power holds the same. And once it's broken, the words alone do it. We said that this applies almost to all significant disputes. We said that minor areas of states will oftentimes deal purely in the purpose and reasoning in regard to this, but in almost all serious disputes, the motivations behind them and the forces that govern the way they are determined are set to a nation's military capabilities. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Presumably, if it is to be mighty in solving disputes, it needs to reach some effective consensus rather than just killing everyone.
And it doesn't kill everyone in the sense that, to take a metaphor from an earlier debate, if I try to take you over the head with a stick, unless you do as I say, and then you proceed to do as I say, that's adequate. That has solved the dispute between us definitively, and will continue to do so long as I have the big stick. that isn't the clutch. In fact, that power is more definite, we would say, and this is the point, is ultimately more definitive than any words on paper. That's the point. States are ultimately unsure of one another's actions or intentions towards them. There has rarely been alliances between states that last for great periods of time based purely on fidelity rather than the strategic interests of those states. And so, the point someone signs an agreement, at some point someone signs an agreement promising to do things, you can never know if that's going to be enforced. The surest way it will be, and the surest way you know its terms will be played out, is if they ultimately reflect the only possible solution of things based upon that power. As if the only way that states could violate it would be to put their interests at risk. We point out that for a great portion of history, the several ways states have resorted to solving disputes is through war or the threat of it. And that ultimately awareness of others' military capabilities and awareness of their ability to bring more to them in a second moment, allows them the ability to intimidate or influence other states to definitive action. Yeah,
how are you defining international conflict and who gave you the legitimacy to do so?
Insofar as when you're going to, presuming you're going to make an argument from legitimacy, I take the reading of that slightly odd POI to be. We would say conflict between states arises in which they have different goals, and those goals, the point, come into some conflict, whether diplomatic or actual military. Moreover, we say that, in terms of states and concerns of legitimacy, states will, in terms of body, the international order, will not, very quick, the methods of legitimacy, tends to be the fact that, states will not significantly break the order, at the point it might incur, costs for them in the future. Because, at the point states act, rashly outside that order, in terms of the interest of others, to put them down. So we know that where, states do not engage to settle their disputes, and when instead resort to diplomatic is because they face threats from others to not act against them. States have little regard to simply, little reason to regard simply a treaty, a binding word, as oftentimes being treated. And have, as I'm going to show you, when those treaties have existed, have been violated, have been formed the interest of power and mind, and have been violated the moment. So, in terms of those institutions and treaties, take the example of the fact that the body that has the most, the single most power to block any action within the UN is based upon, membership of members is based upon their access to nuclear weapons and their perceived status as a great power. Right? The ability, the creation of institutions and treaties, it always reflects the wishes of the most powerful, surrounding. Look at test batteries. Right? They only came into existence at the point at which both the US and the USSR had already tested sufficient amounts of nuclear weapons and didn't have any interest in doing so anymore in the future. They then decided that this was then to be policy for other nations and would be enforced by them militarily at the point they decided. The only time, the time those things will lapse, or the times states will break with them, is that the point they believe those powers will no longer seek to punish them for doing so. We would point out that, ultimately speaking, the formal mechanisms of these institutions are to be developed to reflect those bounds of power. And to the extent that they actually constrain nations, the extent they actually stop them doing things, is only because of the power backing that lies behind them. It has always made sense for states to coordinate their action insofar as if can say them both humiliate themselves. And so so states in that regard will not take action. Will not take action if they know will simply result in being militarily beaten or being oppressed in a sense. And we point out at every time that countries the US have created international orders that were suited to style themselves, they nevertheless broke with them at several moments when it suited the objectives of their foreign policy. They have started legal rules. They have ignored the trade laws and institutions they themselves set up. They have willfully left or entered institutions or agreed to treaties based solely on the short-term advantage, i.e. vis-a-vis the US is all entering the UN after the Korean War was done. Via the US abandoning all pretense that to the point its terms no longer suited. And via every time, and via Iraq or Bosnia, any time the US sought to implement its foreign policy and finds it blocked by institutions originally designed to favor it, it nevertheless goes ahead anyway. Why? Because ultimately any nation that takes a dispute with it will ultimately have to settle that by federal assault. Because whatever legal proceedings those institutions or those treaties engage in, whatever perceived legitimacy they have, at the point it is in the interest of those nations to act against them, they will. And no other nation will challenge them unless they believe that they have a military force to compel them to act against it. They have some course that they can impose upon those nations to make them think twice. This is Peter, for all these reasons, very helpful.
Thank Will for his fine words, and now call on Michael Dunn to open the case for the opposition. Fire Spirit to open the case for the opposition.
Open and Gov loses this debate when they debate the motion, this House believes the sword is mightier than the pen. Maybe. What we're actually debating on our side of the House is that the pen is mightier at solving conflicts. We think that you cannot actively solve a conflict through warfare alone. And because we're going to show that solving a conflict through warfare is always contingent on the pen in the end. The warfare can never be independent, where the pen can, at times, you can resolve conflicts simply diplomatically, but never through warfare alone. We must win this debate. What example do we get coming out of the side government? We say, well, listen, if I have a stick and I say I'm going to hit you unless you do what I do, and you do what I do, I win. Look at that, the warfare won. We don't think this actually settles the dispute, because I still probably hate you, and I still probably hate you more now that you've threatened violence against me. We think that the actual thing that's up for dispute, whatever question is at hand, is only exacerbated, and things are made worse in the long term if warfare is the only mechanism by which we attempt to solve our problems. We think that warfare will always end in the pen, showing that it's absolutely contingent on it. We also think, Mr. Speaker, and members of the panel, other things which I'm going to tell you now. So, we've set up three comparatives in this debate. The first, this idea of contingency. The second, pressure and escalation. And finally, ease of use. We think that we'll find that the pen is mightier in solving a conflict on all three of these comparatives. So like I've told you, warfare is contingent on the pen. We think that the sword can only be mightier in solving a conflict if it can solve a conflict on its own. Since that's not the case, since we have a concession out of the first government speaker that there's always a treaty that happens in the end that necessarily means that the sword is contingent on the pen, whilst the pen is not contingent on warfare, because we see all sorts of diplomatic treaties happening without warfare all the time. They tell you also that the treaties in the pen only works because there's military force backing it. We dispute this on face because we find lots of other things that incentivize treaties, like economic and trade sanctions, things that people are equally scared of more than just warfare. People are equally scared of dying of starvation than they are dying by the sword. No. So we think that we're mightier at solving because it's not just about winning. Because we think that the only feasible way in which the sword can solve a conflict is if it attempts and succeeds to annihilate a population in total. Because then that population no longer has a conflict, no longer has a dispute with whatever the opponent was. When we see that that's not the case, that has never happened empirically, we doubt that it can happen even with the continued proliferation of nuclear weapons. No, we think that there's no way that a dispute can ever fully be settled by warfare alone. We think that it only exacerbates problems. And we think that solving a dispute at the root, what it means to solve a dispute, it means that the operative question at hand is no longer disputed. There is no more ill will, or at the very least, there's no more question up for grabs in which the two or three or however many parties are still debating over. We think that Sure, Dan.
So, if economic sanctions severely hurt people on the ground, why is that an argument for the side of the peaceful pen instead of the mighty sword?
Because economic sanctions are actions done through the pen, and the sword is things like killing people. Moving on, right? So we don't think that the sword solves underlying problems, because to solve underlying problems, you have to have both parties come to the fore and come to mutual understanding, which we don't think would have to happen when half the population is killed and the rest of the population is pretty angry at the people that kill them. We think that warfare doesn't do what they set out to do on side government. In fact, it only makes you fear to express your own view instead of coming into the table and discussing it and coming to actual conflict resolution. Warfare breeds resentment. The pen breeds reconciliation, which we think is important. No. Let's talk about ease of use. So we think that for a lot of reasons, of course you have those who are fighting and the families of the fallen, but we also think on a more nuanced level that there's a psychological cost to the rest of the citizenry when their army is involved in conflict. We see things in the body bag effect all the time, right? When you know that someone in your country is fighting on behalf of you, is fighting for your freedom, and they come back dead in body bags, that takes a huge psychological toll on the country as a whole, which will only serve to breed resentment against whoever the oppressor who you conceive to be the oppressor to be. We think that of course this will happen with things like economic sanctions, but when you have things like economic sanctions and trade sanctions, we think that they're much more easy to solve for a multitude of reasons. And we also think that this long-term resentment that I've been getting at also develops an ongoing cost that happens much longer after the war, right? So once the sword has been put down, because so many lives have been lost, because there's been such a psychological toll, the people within a country, the people within a nation state will never fully feel as though their conflict has been fully solved unless they can get some kind of repentance, unless they can get some kind of revenge or vengeance for the lives that were lost. We don't get this on our side of the house because we don't have the same kind of massacre that's going to be happening outside government, which government needs to defend. Finally, we think that economic action is much more easily done for a multitude of reasons. Of course, it's more remote. So for those, with the United States, we don't see these kinds of things that are happening all the time. We also think that it's just comparatively easy to employ and much, much more efficient for a multitude of reasons. Lastly, based on all the things that the opening government has told us, we think it's important to understand that the pen also plays a vital role, which is the pen writes the check. The government does not have a case without the pen. The pen needs to okay certain actions. The pen pays for the warfare and all these things. So even, Mr. Speaker, members of the panel, you buy all of the opening government argumentation. We don't think their argumentation can stand unless they concede that the pen in the first place has to be the thing that authorizes the action that they wish to take on their side of the house. So if you actually are an advocate for the sword, if you are an advocate for warfare, you need the pen to be able not only to start that, but to end it in a good and effective manner. We are so proud to have voted.
Thanks, Sarah, for your fine speech, and now call on equal aid to continue the case to the
Can you give us an example of this perfect peace where everybody is happy that you described in your speech? Because you didn't say it in your speech, so I doubt it. And I want to talk also about this. Okay, first of all, I'm genuinely intimidated by what Lauren is going to say from her POI, because I know she's pretty drunk and has been in enough problems to not give a shit what happens. It has to give us the legitimacy to decide what is international conflict. I wrote down OG twice and then decided it was also fault of him. Laura says that states might still be unhappy after the stick is used. We often see cases where states are unhappy and don't go to war with states like the US. Guess why? Because they're aware they'll get destroyed if they do. Here's the sword, the thread of the sword, making peace happen. Really, really not. You're intimidating. Where do they try to place this as false, right? We say that the pen is a formality placed over the sword. God, I hate these men. And to make people feel secure, right? It's the sword that props up the pen, not what you said, right? The pen, isn't necessary in that it is only there to make the states that might have lost out from this negotiation, or to make the states that don't have as much sword as other states feel like the pen is nice and it's protected, even though it's not, right? We don't have to show you an example of peace with no treaty, right? Because that's just unrealistic, and that's not the way that we formally do international relations. We have to show you that the sword is the cause when peace happens. Have a good speech, really nice. Fear of the sword is still the sword. So when Clara gets up here and tells you that people hate war because it's happened to them a lot, and that they're afraid of going to war in the future, and that's why they negotiate, guess what? That's what we call the sword, okay? So the pen, is there when it happens, but it's the sword that causes that peace, right? So on to, actually,
yeah, do you agree that there's a greater variety of things that can be done with pen as opposed to sword?
Greater variety of things that can be done with a laptop. I'm not going to take weird semantic points. Stop it. In terms of diplomacy, there are lots of different solutions that you can come up with. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about how when diplomacy actually happens and when there's a solution, it is the sword that has made that happen. It's the sword that's brought it together, right? So how does the sword solve disputes? Okay? So it's not what Michael thinks that we're saying, right? That the sword is used to stab everyone who disagrees with us. And then we win because everyone else is dead, right? It's actually usually the threat of some kind of military force. It's usually the knowledge that a state has, or that a terrorist has, or whoever it is, one side of a conflict, or one side of a multitude of sides of a conflict, that knows that when they take it to a certain point, they will annihilate themselves because they are taking on an enemy that is too strong. The threat of the sword is still the sword. When you know that you are facing off against a military that will beat you, that is when you decide to come to the table. This is what makes people negotiate, right? So the Iran-Iraq War, an 8-year conflict that resulted in stagnation between the two sides, and essentially just them killing each other over and over and over again for 8 years until finally they were brought to a negotiating table. What brought them to a negotiating table? A US ship was caught in the crossfire, and then the US decided that they had had enough. So they dragged Iran by their ears to the negotiating table with, guess what? The threat that if they didn't find a peace, that something would be done about it, that the US would do something about it, because everybody is afraid of them, because everybody knows that then when they bring you to the table, that they are serious, that shit is getting real. They went back to pre-war borders, which is an absolutely ludicrous thing to do after 8 years of violence, because they knew that if they didn't do something, they would be destroyed. This is how the sword works. This is how the sword tells you that you better do something, that you better get your shit together, otherwise we are going to take the big stick and hit you with it, right? So I want to talk about the relationship between the pen and the sword, okay? So as I was saying earlier, the pen functions as a formality over existing power structures that Will was talking about, created by the sword, right? So the US, it is very, very unlikely, it's pretty much impossible, in fact, that the US will ever be compelled to do something by a treaty alone, right? It essentially acts in its own interest, like UN sanctions, things like that. The fact that it has a permanent seat on the Security Council, I wonder why that is. Maybe because it has a giant military. Things like test ban treaties that Will talked about, things like agreements, things like international law. The fact is, it's even
structures, the way that they are created is often based around it. Like, why do we think that drones haven't been made illegal in international law yet? Because everyone knows that it's completely pointless, because the US isn't going to care, right? That a treaty isn't going to compel such a huge power to do something like that, to do something that is not in their interest. They will act in their interest, no matter what happens, because they can. Because that's how things work in international relations, when there's no larger powers that are compelling you to do certain things. Negotiation as a tool is facilitated by the sword. Like the UN and treaties, right, should be able to facilitate discussion on solutions. They should be able to sort of act as like an arbiter, like a mediator between powers. But it's never the UN. Like, it's always someone with more power than you. It's always the US driving Iran and Iraq to the table. It's always the US marching into a conflict and saying, we're here now, like now shit's getting real, now we need a solution. And this isn't unique to the US because it's the US, it's unique to them because they have a lot of power. Like, similar things are true of China and Asia, and things like that. The countries have very little incentive to engage in diplomacy when the only thing that they're staking is like reputation and like potentially like the good results of an agreement that they might come to. The fear for survival, fear of more powerful countries, fear of like the negative consequences, the stick that Joe talked about, the sword, not just the pen, unless you plan to stab them with the pen or threaten to stab them with the pen. It's the sword that they fear. Like, don't let off, like, try to trick you into thinking that the sword is like the economy and everything else. It's actually diplomacy, and that like the only thing that essentially stops diplomacy up is the existence of the sword you propose.
Thank you for her fine speech, and now call on Michael Dunn to continue the case for opening opposition.
Thank God opening government are the UN Secretariat General. They have an exceptionally limited conception of what it means to resolve a dispute, right? It's true that if you hit me with a stick, I might not hit you back because you're bigger than me, William. But I will still hate you, I will still resent you, and I will still undermine you in every single way, including by beating you in this debate. Importantly, they don't resolve disputes, they simply suppress the expression of antagonism. We don't think that's the burden they're required to meet in this debate. A couple of things to say very briefly about the definitions of pens, then I'm going to move on to more substantial material, talking about three things. First off, contingency, why they refuse to engage with it. Secondly, consensus and cooperation, why it's necessary, why they get it. And finally, use and efficacy. First, pens. The comparative in this debate is between diplomacy and military action. That's correct, right? They then said, but diplomacy isn't the economy, right? They have different ministries. The point is that economic tools, things like trade restrictions, things like the threat and the use of economic sanctions are legitimate tools of diplomacy, right? You don't just get diplomatic solutions by doing elephant conversations, right? You do at some point have to use something. We think things other than the expressive threat of military force is the comparative we need to consider, right? The second thing these guys say is, look, right? These people say that the pen, the sword underlies everything. Yes, that's trivially true. Every action that I do is in some measure constrained by the fact that someone might beat me up at some point, right? Theoretically, all our actions and the degree to which we piss people off is constrained by the threat of physical force, right? If that's all you have to prove in this debate, you might as well just go to the bar now, right? You need to accept slightly higher level. We think the explicit threat of physical force is probably what you need to take on. We think that factors, right? Things like targeted sanctions get from leaders of various states. Things like international sharing, and limits on the degree to which these sorts of organized companies can participate in ways of enforcing treaties that most states are concerned with, where we think it's often the most immediate justification for compliance, right? But we told you that conflict resolution does ultimately require a stable future, and that they didn't have to before, right, because there wasn't a war, right? What it didn't do is make Iran and Iran like each other and not try to undermine one another. That's why the Iranian government continues to form the sort of Shia terrorist militias that are driving Iran apart and throwing it into sectarian conflict, right? The dispute between Iran hasn't been resolved. If anything, it's been intensified by the conflict and the memory of it that has burned into every Ayatollah and citizen of that country. Right? So we refute the notion that conflict has been resolved, right? But then they say, no, right? It's not about the initial justification of how to negotiate, right? It's about something bigger. it's about who gets them there, and it's the US. The US is the most military powerful country in the world, so obviously that's why they're there. No, I think the US has a stronger interest than most countries in resolving disputes between Iraq and Iran because of things like, I don't know, oil. Right, even if you don't find that, right, they probably have the greatest ability to affect those sorts of negotiations, the strongest diplomatic corps, with the greatest ability to make aid contingent upon various things, like for instance, compliance with peace treaties. So we think that's exceptionally disingenuous. Look, at the end of the day, if you want to resolve any sort of dispute, you need to give two countries, two warring factions, right, some notion of what their continuing future look like. That requires some process of negotiation. You agree with that. Now, let's talk about consensus and cooperation. So we think long-term peace is only underpinned when two countries have a shared interest in cooperation and in not opposing one another. Yes, it's true, like one country might lose the war and they might not oppose the other one for a bit, right? But the nature of, being of warfare, militaries, is that, like, they're renewable resources, right? You can buy more guns, you can conscript more soldiers, right? Countries rise again and continue to fight wars. The only way in which conflict comes to a real end, right, is when countries have a shared interest in cooperating, right? What does that require? One, some degree of economic cooperation and economic interest, right? You need to not work, if you're trading with someone, you might just likely to want to hate them. Secondly, right, things like aid, right? Just like direct gifts. Thirdly, things like mutual cultural understanding, right? That's why Vietnam didn't stop hating and trying to undermine the United States after the Vietnam War, right? But did when the two started trading, because all of a sudden the Vietnamese realised they needed to sell cheap sneakers, and the Americans were pretty good at buying them, despite the fact they don't exercise very much. Done.
How would your side have solved the conflict in Bosnia and Kosovo?
I don't know. I'll write a policy paper on it and email it to you. I think, there are some times in which you need to engage in military action, right? Genocide probably can't be talked out, right? But the important thing is that international disputes aren't just things like genocide, right? And moreover, the conflict in Bosnia isn't necessarily solved. Rebel groups continue to take pot shots at each other within former Yugoslavia. That resentment still exists to other things, like for instance, a degree of cultural understanding, economic cooperation, to bring those tensions down to a simmer. We think that's disingenuous, right? Moreover, we just like to point out that conflict started as people thought the military action was a great way of resolving disputes anyway. But look, at the end of the day, to resolve disputes, what we also need is an ideological consensus. Recognise the fact that antagonism in states is often based on a set of ideological truths or mistruths, right? Things like, one, faith in the national leadership, right? When the national leadership say that someone is evil, Kim Jong-un says that the Americans are evil, people are more likely to believe when they believe that Kim Jong-un is a god, right? Secondly, things like competing worldviews, the notion that one state is an oppressor. How are these counteracted? Very often by things like communication and diplomacy. Things like letting people know that people in the United States aren't actually suffering. The American economic model actually does work. Also letting people know that leaders can have relationships of trust with one another. That Ronald Reagan can work with Ronald Reagan, and it's not in fact a deceptive shit, except when it comes to the economy, right? This requires diplomacy, right? Undermining these ideological narratives requires diplomacy. North and South Korea are beginning to ease tensions, not because Kim Jong-un just had a change of heart, because he's really scared that South Koreans will attack him, but because North Koreans are beginning to learn that South Korea is actually a more prosperous place, right? That South Korea does in fact neglect its citizens, and that actually that economic model may well offer them some benefits, and that Kim Jong-un is in fact the greatest leader ever. We think that sort of propaganda, that sort of undermining of ideological conflict, and forging a personal relationship between leaders necessary for mutual trust, is necessary for long-term resolution to dispute, only happens with the pair. Finally, use. Kalashnikovs are the mightiest weapon of the 20th century, but they kill the most people. They're incredibly effective. Things like wars are very hard to start for the reasons Clara gave you. We think that impairs their mightiness. Moreover, in the long run, they make empathy worse, which is somewhat unsurprisingly, when other people kill you, you're less likely to want to work with them, less likely to want to form a pace with them, more likely to hate them because of the ways in which they've undermined people you know, love, and empathise with. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, fighting doesn't solve anything. Haters shouldn't hate. Thank you.
We thank your Wilson Crucial for his fine speech. Dan Welling to open the case for closing government.
Ladies and gentlemen, uniquely perhaps for some of you, Karen and I don't speak English as our first language. We're therefore not willing to engage in semantics, because we don't speak your language good enough to understand the wordplay that goes on. But more importantly, we don't want to engage in semantics because we're talking today about an incredibly important notion, namely how to save lives. So we find it disingenuous they were having jokes about pens and swords and whatnot, when the motion simply asks you to consider how best to save lives of people worldwide and world are all threatened day in their existence. In that, our burden is quite simple. What we're going to show to you is that military intervention, which often is the primary source of dispute and conflict actually in the late part of the 20th century and first part of the 21st century, why that is absolutely necessary to have and why having the pen simply isn't enough. So 2 points. One, why do you think diplomacy as a preference is damaging towards conducting dispute settlement, and why it makes disputes more difficult to settle, and secondly, why do you think intervention as a preference is better in that. In that, I would do 2 things first. One, in terms of contingency. We recognise that contingency works both ways. At the moment, that if you just write it like something on a pen and make it a law, that doesn't mean it necessarily becomes true and everyone will follow it. You still need, at the very least, some degree of force to have some people go forward with that law. You may need to have, for instance, on the very basic level, a police force that can put 2 warring people from a previous ethnic tribe outside of each other if they're just having a conflict or maybe fight, because otherwise they could escalate. That's on the very basic level. On a stronger level, you may need to have a military presence in order for people who are the extremist side, who may not accept the negotiations and settled by the pen to go forward. So we think in that case, it's a bit of a what to consider what contingency is. Moreover, they tell you, like, sanctions. On like a semantic level, we think sanctions could fit both sides of the house. Yes, they're put down by the pen, but they achieve broadly the same right as a sword, which still hurts people in instance. Moreover, they have never proven to you, no thank you, why sanctions are effective. They haven't given you concrete examples of that. If you look at where sanctions have been effective, we can't really think of reasons why. If you look for these character nations, no thank you. South Africa wasn't really caused by having sanctions lifted. It was by strikes in the mining industry. It was when the CEOs lost enormous amount of economic power, and in that way it was conducted approach within South Africa where people started realizing that things were bad in an instant. So we don't think, no thank you, and that way they solve anything in that. Ironically, to reposition themselves, it's unclear as to why it has been effective, considering we see no way for them to slow down the nuclear program, and they're still likely to get it. So in that way, they haven't really shown us any benefits in terms of sanctions, whatever. We're unsure, and they conceded that sanctions aren't really helpful in cases like Bosnia. We don't think that sanctions are helpful in Bashar al-Assad, because we think that Assad, maybe we get a bit less money out of like sanctions, but he's fighting to save his life and the life of his ethnic minority. That's what he's choosing and elected for to protect. And we don't need to stop just because a little bit less of money or just like little inconvenience in that. Moreover, sanctions need to be unanimous, otherwise you get things like China still giving money and food aid to North Korea. You need the sanctions are undermined in that goal. Like shaming, quite often in the dictatorship, it is the case. It is the case that there's control of the media in an instance, so shaming has never really proven to be effective. In fact, in the Middle East, most people think that the United States is a big spectacle this piece, so it's been pretty ineffective to shame there. Actually, there's been a counter-shaming going on there. Sanctions simply aren't part of this debate. No, thank you. Why then, therefore, is diplomacy as a preference really bad? Firstly, in terms of timing. No, thank you. If diplomacy becomes the accepted notion that we should always strive to go for diplomacy first and go for diplomacy as long as possible, what that happens is that we take a long time while a conflict is ongoing. Here's where it's problematic. When a conflict becomes ongoing for a long time, a conflict becomes more difficult to solve. The sides get more entrenched. They hate each other more because they've seen more and more family members die. There are more interests that are collided because it isn't a simply question of, for instance, fighting against a dictator. You also have different perceptions of what you want to do with the state afterwards, which means that those movements split off from fractions and then fight again. That's why 2.5 years ago in Syria, we had a broadly united rebel movement under a broadly united platform who was fighting against Assad for freedom. Now, with thousands, like literally thousands, different rebel movements, all having different aims. We have terrorist movements in that they have started fighting against them, or ISIS is fighting the Free Syrian Army because those international, because people have become more realistic and are fighting just for survival and no longer for ideological goals. that means that the fighting becomes more difficult in that. Also, when fighting goes on longer, infrastructure gets destroyed, so the economic recovery becomes damaging, etc. That means if you choose to go for diplomacy very at the first hand and only go towards fighting later when it's no longer unavoidable, that fighting in itself becomes less effective, but also diplomacy has failed in that. They also don't have to show you, no thank you, why diplomacy anyway is effective in solving disputes. Because often these disputes transgress boundaries like reason. There are often things, there are century-old tensions in that, which are very hard to rationally solve in that, because people really want to win. But moreover, when someone thinks, like, I can win, no thank you, I can win because I have, for instance, more technological advantage than the other side, I have an incentive to give up because I can win using the sword. When you then want to use the sword to settle disputes, no thank you, that becomes incredibly difficult to do so. Because Assad thought, for instance, that he could win because he had more tanks. And only if we were to use military intervention to limit the amount of tanks he had, that's the point where he wants to go to the negotiation table. Closing.
Do you think that there's an international gender war going on?
I think at best, that point proved that there's something like a patriarchy, etc. We save human lives. At best, you can prove that some lives are made worse off because maybe some women have it terrible. We think that we actually save the lives so you can fight about other means. So that would always think of important for you in this side of round. Finally, the problem is often you can't get people to the negotiation table because people don't realise something in the conflict is going on. Quite often, entrenched elites who do make decision-making process aren't really hurt by the fact that there are issues going on. So, for instance, Ukraine at the moment, we have elitists who have entrenched themselves who don't feel the need for protesters because they're currently standing on Maiden Square, they're currently not being tackled by the police forces. At the moment, that they themselves are existentially threatened by Western intervention, which proves to offset them, hurt their confidence, by the use of force, which can destabilize them. That means that we actually create a stick that is necessary to actually get them towards the negotiation table. Fair enough.
Where is required to open case when there is an opposition?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, strangely enough, no matter how many finals you win, not that many, you still get terrified about trying to explain an idea that's in your head while you're quite wrong to a wide group of people. What I want to talk about is, first of all, the idea of conflict and how your understanding of conflict is part of the problem. Secondly, I want to talk about the pen, apparently, and what that means, and talk about negotiation, what that actually means to people who are experiencing conflict. Metaphors aside, we think that this is a debate about what is the best course of action for someone who is engaged or experiencing a conflict. I mean, that's pretty fair. And we think that we should understand that we think that the proposition has both teams have massively misunderstood what the idea of conflict actually is, and also what the idea of an end of conflict actually is. We understand that force sometimes has a place. We're not against immediate action to stop immediate genocide that, for instance, the UN is not aware of. We think that's not about ending a conflict. Stopping immediate aggression doesn't end a conflict. It simply moves it to a different location and a different time. We don't think that's what we're debating here. We're talking about the resolution of conflicts in a way that allows those societies and those people involved in conflicts to move forward. That's fair enough. Further, we also think it's worth bearing in mind that this is about the process of getting to the resolution of conflict. It's not simply about judging concluded conflicts, but it's also about judging the acts that people took part in getting to the end of that conflict. So we also want to talk about how we judge what people do to try to end a conflict and evaluate what they did in those, just in the process of that, and not just in terms of whether or not people stopped fighting, but also what happened in the process of stopping that fighting. So our first point is this idea of conflict, because we find it quite offensive, as lovely ladies from Second Opposition, that conflict has been described and decided by the proposition side as being an state affair, and something that statesmen do, what smart and sensible men wearing suits do when they sit around drinking brandy and deciding whether to invade the Niger or to colonize another aspect of Africa because the lines aren't quite straight enough. We think that conflict is international when it crosses boundaries. So let's give some examples. We think that a conflict that is international could be, for example, the fact that abortion rates in this country are dictated by money flowing from another country, i.e. America, and that impacts on my existence as a woman in this country. That's international, and it's a conflict, because it risks my life if I get pregnant. We also think a conflict that is international, as a perhaps example, is where religious groups in the United States fund groups in Nigeria and in Uganda to hunt down gay people, to pass laws against gay people, and to make their lives existentially threatened. We think that's an international conflict. I'll explain what this matters for the motion later, but it's important to understand. First of all, second of all, we think that conflict needs to be understood as not just about the idea of actual physical violence happening upon your person, but even that threat of violence, living within that threat of violence, living within that fear of that violence. And we think, and I'll explain in a moment, why that continues when you solve things with the sword. We think, no thank you, we think that conflict that is solved by the idea of the primacy of the sword, which we're perfectly happy to accept, is things like aggressive military movements. Like that's fine. It can be all the different types of swords you want, and you could name a missile the Sword 2 and deploy that. We're fine with that. We think that the idea of that kind of violent ending to a conflict means that we're way into debate here. Means that you are creating a primacy of the physically violent as being what solves that conflict. What does that mean? It means that the conflict is solved only under your understanding of conflict, which is violence, right? Which is like actual groups that you recognize as violent actors fighting against each other. What it doesn't solve is creating this idea that conflict between people and groups of people should be solved through violent action. When you have a peace that's secured through violence, all you're left with is the group that lost out, thinking the way that I can change this is becoming more powerful under this idea of the sword, by getting a bigger sword, if you will. So many cock metaphors. That's really problematic, because all you're left with then is a ticking time bomb. That's why no matter how many military interventions we have had in our history, same regions continue to have violent breakouts of these different types of conflict. Because all you're doing is reinforcing this idea that when you disagree or don't understand or don't appreciate another group of people, you should react with violence. We think that's massively problematic. Secondly, so what's our comparative that we're offering in terms of dissent? Because we think we're not just saying that two sides that are fighting against each other through various types of conflict should just negotiate rather than using violence. We're saying that what negotiation requires is an understanding of the other side in order to drive you to that negotiation if you're not being driven by some kind of physical threat. What does that mean? And here I'm getting into metaphors again because it's fun. It means things like people explaining their own experience, for example by writing with a pen. We think that kind of, sorry about that, we think that it's much more important that people are given the capacity to understand the other side of the conflict, rather than to be told to not kill the other side of the conflict. That's why we think that solutions, like things like truth and reconciliation committees, the grassroots in Rwanda, massive arts council funding moving to Northern Ireland, create the capacity for people to write about their experiences, specifically people who don't have swords, like women, or like specifically marginalized groups. Then that's what people, by expressing your own experience, not only of that conflict, but also just as you, as a member of that society, means that the other side of that conflict now can try to understand your experience of it, and you can move to a place where you don't have that conflict, even within your own experience, your own feelings, never mind expressing it through physical violence. When you only implement things by force, by the end of a gun, by a sword, whatever, all you're doing is stopping it in that moment. But you never remove this misunderstanding or this distance that exists between groups of people. And that's why we think that when the pen is involved, when expression is involved, and engagement is involved, we think that all of conflicts, not just one big one, but all international conflicts can be properly solved, and that's why we're very happy to oppose this bill.
Thank you, Maureen, for your fine speech. We now call on Tara to close the case for close the government and proposition as a whole.
Guys, can I just before we start, keep the chat to a minimum and we were struggling to hear some of the comments.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about conflict, what kind of conflicts do exist in the real world, and how do we solve them best. I'm going to talk about how I think that a narrative of a pen is harmful in ever-settling international disputes, and I'm going to talk about long-term reconciliation. But before I do that, I'll quickly engage with the abortion debate Murren really wanted to talk about. The problem with the abortion debate is that we think that diplomacy and a pen will never solve that. We think that probably quite influential institutions like the state, like the church, hold power over the discourse about abortion that we're having in society. We're not solving that problem by finding them and asking them in a really nice voice, can you please support abortion right now? We're solving that by more violent, more straightforward actions, like protesting in the streets. We think that an even small case conflict, or conflict that don't necessarily transcend national boundaries and don't necessarily involve the military action, which is the debate that we were having with the other two teams. We still think that only negotiation isn't going to work. We need people to hear about it, and that is why we need to be vocal about those things. So what kind of conflicts are we talking about? Recognize, Mr. Speaker, that most of the international disputes that are going on, most of the conflicts that are happening in the status quo are conflicts in which we have humanitarian intervention. Why is that relevant for this debate? It's relevant for this debate that first of all we see that loads of the things of sanctions that opening up the opposition was so incredibly proud of are probably abortion debate. Not only in case of semantics, because we've explained quite well we think that sanctions might fall under our side of the debate when sanctions make sure that people in North Korea are dying because of hunger. We don't necessarily think that dying because of hunger is less bad than dying because of a gunshot. We think that in that case it might fall on our side of the debate. We also think that sanctions probably are not always necessarily effective, and are especially not effective when we're not in a conflict because we want to suppress people, when we engage in conflict because we want to stop people being suppressed by their suppressor. In those kinds of conflicts, their kinds of negotiation and diplomacy are not going to work. Bringing me to my second point, that if they do work, we have a different problem. Because the problem is that they're going to create a narrative in which the pen, in which diplomacy is always more important and it's always something that we should do first. They recognize that in some situations, violence is inevitable to, for example, stop genocide or other kinds of atrocities from happening. Why do we then think that the narrative of diplomacy is harmful? The narrative of diplomacy made that we're going to keep on trying to solve conflicts by means of a pen, by means of words, by means of being nice. The problem with that is that it's state leaders engaging in a conversation while on the ground people are still suffering. That kind of suffering is going to lead to a continual perpetuation of ideas of us versus them, and a continuation of harms done to the people that live in those countries. Michael.
Most disputes aren't genocide, but we don't think that the Albanians should have asked the Serbs to talk it out amid genocide, right? We think that the Serbs shouldn't have bombed schools in Sarajevo, a